Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Today I am joined by Lawrence W. Reed of lawrencewreed.com. He is the president emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education, one of my favorite organizations. Mr. Reed, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Keith. Thanks again for having me.
Of course. What are historical narratives and why are they important?
Well, historical narratives, let's say in contrast to a straight documentary, tells a story that has a genuinely true background to it, at least. But often the characters are imagined or the specific situations are created, and then you write it, as if it happened. That's it's not something. It's not the style in which I personally write. I tend to write nonfiction, period. But historical narratives traditionally blend both fiction and nonfiction.
So why are those so important? It seems like, the past is the past. Regardless of whatever happened, let's just focus on the future.
Well, I think they tend to be very entertaining, and as long as people go into them knowing that they are not word for word documentaries, that they do involve imaginary situations and characters, but with a genuinely uh, accurate backdrop. I think they can tell stories, they can make points, they can advance principles with a background that people can relate to because they know something about history.
Karl Marx would generally say things like, the narrative of history. It's we had slavery and then feudalism and then capitalism. Therefore, the logical move in this good direction would later be dictatorship of the proletariat and then communism, abolition of private property. If you want to give people sort of a narrative to live by who advocate libertarianism or conservatism, something in this small government voluntary realm, would you more or less create a story? Would you have sort of pillars like Marx did, where we're sort of moving in this direction? How would you give someone a kind of story to be a part of?
Well, to begin with, I would not use the style that Karl Marx used because that was more like prophecy by someone who was not a prophet. He had no idea what the future held. And to suggest that history is governed by certain predetermined stages, and at some distant point in the future, one stage will give rise to the next, really was just pure supposition. There's no factual case or logic to it. It's just Karl Marx deciding he wanted to fit his ideological narrative into future history that hadn't happened yet. And of course, we know how inaccurate he was, not only in his prophecies for the future, but in the way he understood economics and human nature. So I wouldn't use his approach at all. Uh, my personal approach is, I'm very much of a nonfiction writer, but I see the value in things like novels or a historical narrative that is partially novelized, because again, people can relate to the background in which the situations and characters develop because they are somewhat aware of it. It's not a totally new, it's not like writing something about life on some planet we haven't yet discovered. I mean, in which case everything's made up.
When it comes to the beginning of American history, the New York Times has sort of pinned the 1619 project as the beginning of American history, the new beginning. Why? Because this is when the first slaves were brought to America. When it comes to the history of slavery in America, where do mainstream historians get it wrong, if at all?
Well, mainstream historians, by and large, will part company with the 1619 narrative from the New York Times. That particular narrative is a classic example of somebody deciding, here is my ideology. Now, how do I shape history that already happened to fit my narrative? How can I pick and choose among things in the past so as to seemingly verify the ideology or the narrative I have predetermined? I don't think that's either history or good storytelling. That's a perversion of history. I think the best approach is to look at all things to the extent we can that happened and try to identify certain patterns or themes or character traits that seem to stand out as determinative of events of the day. If you do that, then the episode in 1619 is but one of many instances in American history and hardly defining of what America was or became. I think you could pick, say, the Mayflower Compact, which was in 1620, and say, well, that's the defining instance or episode in American history that has so much to say about what came afterwards. The Mayflower Compact was between the Pilgrims and the other half of the crew, or I should say, the passenger list of the Mayflower, in which they agreed voluntarily to a representative form of government once they landed. That tells you more about really what happened in America afterwards, with all of its flaws, including slavery. But those are flaws in most cases that we have since conquered, and they are not flaws that are or ever were peculiar to this country. America did more in many cases, in many ways, to end the slavery of the individual in one form or another than just about any other country in the history of the world.
One of the things I noticed when I started studying history was while slavery and colonialism did exist in America's past, it's one of the probably if the least unique thing about America or the
Yeah.
West in general. If it's the least unique thing, I mean, there's a tablet, the Code of Yornamu. I think it's like 2,000 years old. There, 9 of the 34 laws talk about slavery. Why is the least unique thing about American history constantly being put at the center of the American discussion?
Well, I think the people who do that, who make that error, who try to make slavery such a centerpiece and determining factor of just about everything else, I think they first have decided what their personal agendas are, and then they are taking certain events out of context and blowing them up into things far more determinative of our history than they ever were. Um, yeah, if you look at slavery, I mean, that's something that has afflicted almost every corner of the globe, certainly every continent, but Antarctica has had at one time or another slavery. And at one time, you could say that the great majority of people living were slaves or serfs, or at least had to live in constant fear of the people with political power. That was the order of the day for most of human history. America came along and not by itself, but with a few other places as well, within 100 years or so. America came along and said, hey, it doesn't have to be that way. And we're going to start freeing people up. We didn't do it all in one fell swoop, but we created a system which allowed us over time to perfect and improve the condition of human liberty. And although we still have work to do, we've gone further in that direction than just about anybody else.
I want to give you a general summary of what I had learned at Arizona State University and in high school. You tell me if this is accurate, inaccurate, or what's missing.
Okay.
In the Industrial Revolution, you had the robber barons, Carnegie, Rockefeller, constantly the strong exploiting the weak. Finally, after all this suffering, Teddy Roosevelt stepped in with antitrust laws to protect the public from these exploiters. Antitrust laws are good because they protect the vulnerable from the strong. What, if anything, is wrong with that concept?
Just about everything. I hardly know where to begin. I know that is common mythology, and it's simple. It is you just expressed it pretty fully in a matter of 30 seconds, and it sounds plausible. But it's one of those things that when you dig a little deeper and you examine in particular the persons and the performance of certain companies that come under attack so often, you find very frequently a very different story. You mentioned Rockefeller, for example. He's the great boogeyman in American economic history, according to those who are hostile to freedom, free markets, or capitalism. And the story goes, well, he was a monopolist. But you look a little closer and you discover that's a myth. You know, monopolies are supposed to be firms or companies or even governments that restrict output and raise the price and don't care much about the quality of the product and abuse the customer. You look at Rockefeller's Standard Oil and you find that the price of Standard's principal product, which was kerosene in the first half century of its existence, it steadily fell. The price steadily fell dramatically from something like 40 cents a gallon to 3 cents a gallon. And the quality of the product steadily improved. And yes, Rockefeller got big, but he always had to deal with competition, not only domestic, but also very fierce foreign competition. But because he earned a lot of money along the way, which represented a mere fraction of the benefit that he provided to the world's consumers, he's often held up as, you know, greedy, robber baron. But again, you look at the specifics and the charge that he engaged in predatory price cutting, for instance, that he slashed the price in order to drive people from the marketplace, competitors, and then after they were gone, he raised the price again. There's no factual evidence for that, and that was proven by Professor John McGee. All you have to do is look at the Journal of Law and Economics, October 1958. You'll find the definitive study saying that never happened. Rockefeller would have been foolish even to try it. And yet that charge is repeated over and over again. Teddy Roosevelt, as you mentioned, is portrayed as, wow, here's the guy who saved us with antitrust law. The first antitrust law was in 1890, before Teddy appeared on the scene. So you can't credit him for that or blame him for that. It was called the Sherman Act, and it was one of the most nebulous and ridiculous laws Congress has ever passed. It just simply said, you know, if you're a monopoly, then the government can come after you. I mean, to boil it down. The point is, it did not define what constitutes a monopoly. It didn't describe the behavior that somehow does harm to consumers, and that therefore should be adjudicated or reprimanded. It was left to subsequent law to try to put some flesh on the bones, and now we know from a century of scholarship that most antitrust has actually harmed consumers far more than it has benefited.
Let's talk about a few other people from the robber baron era. When it comes to Cornelius Vanderbilt or Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, what do we need to know about these individuals to have an accurate understanding of what took place in the past?
I think if you look at I mean, you can make suppositions till the cows come home, but if you look at data, that often tells a story very different from what somebody's ideology would suggest. The fact is that the services these guys provided, the products that they produced, all during the period that they were getting big in the marketplace, steadily improved. The price went down. Competition was just as fierce when they were done with their work as when they began their work. You had Cornelius Vanderbilt, for instance, engaged in a number of businesses. He was in railroads, he was in steamships. When he was in the steamship business, he had to compete with a government subsidized steamship company. And this is chronicled by the great historian and good friend of mine, Burton Folsom, in his book, The Myth of the Robber Barons. But Vanderbilt kept saying to Congress, hey, why are you subsidizing this other guy to build a steamship line to carry passengers across the Atlantic when I can do it without a subsidy or do it for half the subsidy? And he never took the subsidy, but he eventually beat the subsidized one simply because he was better. And I mean, you could say, well, isn't that evil? He did it for greedy purposes. Well, you know what? He's not in the charity business. Who is? A few nonprofits maybe, but the great majority of the goods and services that make us wealthy as a people are produced by for-profit, bottom line, accountable and competitive private enterprises. Vanderbilt was no exception. So I think a person really has to shed, if they have a bias against successful people, if they are envious of those who have more than they do, if they count other people's blessings instead of their own, yeah, then they're going to look at history in a jaundiced light, and they're going to find a lot of villains and victims. But history is rarely so simple as that caricature would suggest.
When it comes to the idea of profit, it seems like people think they're making a big point when they were a profit seeker. And I said, yes, and these evil customers only come into my store because they want goods and services for their own self-interest, as if there's anything horrible with
Yeah.
with that. From an economic standpoint, as the president emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education, what is it that people need to have a general understanding of when it comes to the idea of profit? What is the average person missing?
That's a great question, and it's one that I dealt with when I was teaching at Northwood University years ago, because I had some students who came into class as freshmen thinking that, oh, profit, doesn't that mean greed? And, isn't that a bad thing? And so here's what I used to do. I used to say to students, okay, imagine $100 worth of stuff, ingredients, factors of production, whatever you want to call them. And some guy takes those $100 worth of stuff, and he plays with them, shapes them a certain way, and puts them in a certain place where he thinks people will want the end result. And lo and behold, people are willing to give him $150 for that $100 worth of stuff that he played around with and changed, transformed, and put in the right place. Okay. Well, we might say, well, he made a profit. Should we be horrified by that? No, we should say he added value. He took X amount and made it X plus. Would it have been virtuous if he had taken that $100 worth of stuff and turned it into something that people would only give him $50 for? I mean, any numbskull can do that. All you have to do is let a match to it, and somebody will give you less for it than what they would have before. But for you to consistently earn that profit by adding value is not an easy thing to do. And entrepreneurs will tell you time and time again, they didn't succeed at everything. They always had to take a risk. They failed at some things, but they learned from their mistakes. They bounced back, they persevered, and they pleased customers along the way. So profit is a sort of a measure of service to others. If you earn it, it's because people are in effect saying by their purchases, what you did with that stuff is now worth more than if I had gone out myself and bought all the ingredients on my own.
One final thing on the robber barons before we move on. Please remind me of the metrics that we could use to determine whether these people were parasitic or they were producers to society. The one that came to mind was before we determine that, let's see if whatever they were producing, Carnegie steel, was it going up in price over time? Certainly, evil, greedy monopolist. We should see prices always rising in steel and the workers' wages constantly decreasing. What are some metrics we can use to really make sure we have an accurate understanding of what happened?
Well, certainly the price of the product is one metric. Over time. And in the case of Carnegie, the reason he made his money was he figured out how to make steel cheaper than anybody else. And anybody who had to purchase steel for the construction of this or that or whatnot greatly benefited by Carnegie's genius. That's one measure or metric. Another one would be to the extent you can measure the quality of the product. I mean, if every time you go to the store and you buy Campbell's soup, but tomato soup, but it has fewer tomatoes in it than the day before, you can say, well, maybe the price hasn't changed, but the quality of the product certainly has. Well, in the case of Carnegie, not only did his steel become cheaper, it also became better and tougher and stronger. Another metric would be return on investment, because great entrepreneurs rarely start out with a bundle of money. They don't start with their billions. They often start in their garage and turn their genius, along with the help of their workers and investors, into something of great value. Well, it's important to know what kind of return did they pay investors, because investors are what? They're taking their savings and entrusting them to this gentleman or woman. to engage in business, and they deserve a return. In fact, no entrepreneur is going to attract capital if he or she never pays a return. So return on investment is another good measure. And there again, you want value creation, and that's what you get in a free society. Those who don't create value, those who subtract from it, will not attract investors and will not attract customers. And so before long, their mistakes are obvious and they're history, or they go to work for somebody else. So those are among the metrics. Now, certainly you'll want to also look at conduct. I mean, you can certainly make money if you cut corners and cheat people sometimes, but that kind of tactic tends to be short term, catches up with you. And if government is doing its only legitimate job, it will certainly provide a legal channel for redress of grievances on the part of consumers or even competitors. But if you're an honest person and you're adding value to society and you're taking the risks needed to build an enterprise, you will be rewarded in the marketplace. And that is the most important metric of all.
Of course, and we can clearly see this when it comes to the Fortune 500. If you compare it today to, I think, 1955, I think only 60 companies are still in there. There's this constant turnover. There's this constant innovation that has to take place, which, of course, the voluntary sector seldom gets the credit it deserves.
Oh, that's right. And Keith, if I may add, I don't want to suggest that everybody in business is on the up and up. To the extent that some business people use their political connections to get a special favor, to get legislators to give them a subsidy. You know, as a believer in freedom and free markets, I mean, I am vociferously against that. I want a fair field and no favors. No, I don't want the playing field biased by the intervention of politicians who try to pick winners and losers with other people's money. So all that I've said applies to market entrepreneurs, not political entrepreneurs, and certainly not market entrepreneurs who mix politics in with their productive activity.
And you use the perfect example of Edward Collins versus Cornelius Vanderbilt. That one of my favorite stories.
Yeah.
When it comes to the Great Depression, general narrative, you had this unregulated capitalism. This gave us a Great Depression because Herbert Hoover basically sat back and just said, well, it'll take care of itself. Fortunately, the voters got some sense into them, elected FDR. He gave us the New Deal. That got us out of the Great Depression. What is wrong, if anything, with what I just said?
That is certainly one of the most horrific and all too commonplace incorrect historical narratives. Where to start? Again, that narrative, I think, was created and propagated over the years because it fit somebody's ideology or a number of people's ideology. It fits neatly into the "we hate capitalism" camp. We need bigger government to take charge of the economy camp. But when you, again, look at the actual facts, you'll find that government had its depression. It first through the Federal Reserve System, which is a creation of the government. We're still paying a price for that monster today. The Fed expanded the nation's money and credit supply by, according to Murray Rothbard, 65% or so from 1924 to 29. We know that period as the Roaring '20s. We had good things happening. You had Calvin Coolidge cutting tax rates, and that was helpful, very positive. But at the same time, you had the Fed spiking the punch, creating a bubble, driving interest rates to record lows. This easy money flowing into the system, creating a boom that would have to sooner or later be corrected. And that began in late 1929 with the bust in the stock market. It was a classic bubble caused by the Fed. And it was a bubble pricked by the Fed, which had begun to raise interest rates dramatically as early as early 1929. Well, the Depression might have been only a recession and may have ended in a year, except there were a series of crazy interventions thereafter that took a recession and made it a depression. In June of 1930, didn't have a depression yet, but President Herbert Hoover and the Congress seeing naggingly high unemployment, decided, hey, let's close the borders to trade. Let's raise tariffs to an all-time high. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of June 1930. That shut down world trade. It led to retaliation by other governments against American goods. That took a recession, made it a depression. That's not a free market phenomenon. That's an act of government. 1932, in the midst of depression with unemployment 20% or so, what did they do? They doubled the income tax. Imagine that, in the midst of a depression. If you weren't already flattened by the Smoot-Hawley tariff, now you really got slammed. The top rate was raised from 24% to 65%, and all kinds of other taxes were raised. That was very depressing. And then you had an election in which Franklin Roosevelt, the Democrat nominee, ran against the incumbent Herbert Hoover, the Republican. And Roosevelt said some things that I would have supported. He said, Herbert Hoover is the greatest taxing and spending president in memory. And we're going to balance the budget and cut government spending, get it off your back and out of your way. He was the laissez-faire candidate, if there was one, in 1932. So he wins election, but then does just the opposite of everything that he promised. And that's why you get 7 more years of depression, because Franklin Roosevelt, being basically an economic ignoramus, his own close advisor, James Warburg, made that plain in his book, Hell Bent for Re-election. He starts jacking up taxes, which he has assailed Hoover for doing. But before he's done, the top rate will go to 91%. Piles on the regulations, price controls, and so forth. In other words, that narrative that the economy was laissez-faire, hands-off, minimal government is nonsense. The government caused the Great Depression, and then we lingered in it for a decade because of a series of stupid interventions thereafter.
How does something like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, one might say, well, yes, it restricted trade with foreigners, which is good because it creates jobs in America, and that's how you would grow the economy. How is it that enacting tariffs would hurt the domestic economy?
A fundamental principle, Keith, of trade is that you cannot close the door to imports without closing the door to exports. In other words, if foreigners can't sell here because our tariffs on their goods are so high, well, then how can they earn the dollars that they need to buy here? The cars don't come from Japan if they can't sell them here, and therefore the boat doesn't go back to Japan with American grain. That's why, for instance, agriculture in America was particularly hard hit by Smoot-Hawley. It was one of our biggest export industries. About a third of what farmers were producing on American farms was destined for overseas markets. But now with Smoot-Hawley, foreigners can't earn dollars, and farmers are stuck with all this stuff and no markets to sell it in. And every business that depended upon the prosperity of the farmer, from rural banks to fertilizer companies, they go into depression as well. So it's an easy, alluring temptation to think that you help your economy by forcing people to not buy from a foreigner. But it immediately boomerangs. And even if the foreign government doesn't retaliate, which they usually do, it boomerangs anyway, simply because you've made foreign goods too expensive to sell here, and then foreigners can't earn the dollars they need to buy from us.
So we get a double dip recession in 1937, 1939. Henry Morgenthau comes out and says, look, I've been part of this administration. We've spent more than ever, and unemployment's as bad as it previously was. We've had all this time, and it hasn't given us what we need. So historians have kind of seen this and said, okay, we admit it wasn't necessarily the New Deal, but we had to try something. What really got us out was entering into the Second World War by conscripting 12 million men. The Second World War got us out of the Great Depression. What do you say to that?
Yeah, that's another very common but also incorrect narrative. On the surface, it appears to be plausible because unemployment dramatically fell with American entry into World War II. Well, we took 11 million men and drafted them into the workforce, the government workforce, as soldiers. They were taken out of the domestic workforce, so they didn't count anymore as unemployed. So yeah, you take 11 million unemployed and take them out of the equation, your unemployment number is going to look better. But if you look at various measures of standards of living during the war years, at best, the American standard of living stagnated. And that's at best, because you could make a strong case that it actually declined. We were, instead of making washing machines and automobiles for domestic consumption, we were making airplanes and tanks and guns. And arguably, we had to do that to win the war, but don't confuse that with, an improving economy. We had to suffer through the war years with an economy at best that was stagnating. We didn't really see economic recovery until the war ended. And there are two big factors that help explain why the Depression finally came to an end, in real terms as well as in those more artificial ways. In 1945 and 46, we had the biggest reduction in government spending in American history, largely demobilization of the military after World War II. A Keynesian economist would say, uh-oh, government spending collapsed? Well, then we're going to have another depression. And some people thought we would, but we had just the opposite, because when government spending went down, what that meant was you had vast amounts of resources that now could flow into the far more efficient private sector. Now you could make those washing machines and automobiles instead of stuff that we're going to blow up half a world away. That was one very beneficial thing, a reduction in government spending. But you also had a new president, Harry Truman. And, I don't count him as one of our better ones, but he was a darn sight better than Franklin Roosevelt. Harry Truman was not this New Deal, run roughshod over capitalism and kind of guy. He got rid of a lot of the radical New Dealers, and he signed on, maybe reluctantly, but he did sign on to a dramatic reduction in the corporate income tax rate. It went in one fell swoop. The income tax rate on corporate income went from 90% down to 38%. Immediately after World War II. Harry Truman signed that into law. Well, just ask yourself, if you're a business and on one day, the government's going to take as much as 90% of what you've earned, but the next day it says, no, we won't take any more than 38, isn't that going to affect your behavior? I mean, of course it will. I mean, it's a dramatically improved situation for things like risk-taking and expansion of your businesses and the hiring of new workers. I mean, so those are responsible for the recovery, not the New Deal or the war spending that simply kept us in a prolonged depression.
When it comes to the well-being of, I hate the term, the workers, as if entrepreneurs don't do any work,
Yeah.
as if people who don't get paid and do work around the house, as if they're not valuable. It's ridiculous. But when it comes to helping the working class, people in entry-level jobs up to working in their later years in life, what is it about the free market that you support that makes it a place where the workers would greatly benefit from?
The free market means such things as choice. It means that you have more than one option in so many aspects of life, whether it be as a consumer buying goods, among competing providers who have every incentive to treat you well, and or those who usually don't go very far, or to where you want to work, or even whether or not you want to start a business yourself. A free market means that a man or a woman who is a worker today, employed by another person, can become an employer tomorrow. I mean, that happens in a free economy all the time, every day. Most successful entrepreneurs will tell you that they weren't always entrepreneurs from age 3. They worked for other people for a time, but they had some creative genius and some risk-taking willingness. And they, at one point, decided they wanted to create an enterprise. A free market allows you to do that. And through the competition among employers and the competition among creators of goods and services, every worker benefits. You get more stuff at lower prices of better quality, the more competition that you have.
Is forming a union consistent with the principles of free markets?
It depends on what the union is going to do. In other words, once again, just as you would judge a company or should judge a company by its conduct and performance, you should judge unions on their conduct and performance. A union can perform a very beneficial uh, responsibility or activity if it brings to the attention of the employer issues in the workplace that individual workers may feel reluctant to bring. That's a positive contribution. If they enable the purchase of certain services by their workers in bulk at lower price, that's a way that traditional unions or trade associations have been beneficial. It's where I draw the line is when a union says, now we want to claim to represent every worker on this site, whether they choose to be a part of us or not. We need the compulsion of government to come in here and tell people if we get 50% plus one to join the union, everybody else has to join. Even though you have the 49 plus percent that might say, wait a minute, it's not for me. I'd rather continue to bargain for myself. No thanks. It's compulsory unionism that does a lot of harm. And immediately it insulates to a considerable degree union leadership from the consequences of their own bad actions, because workers can't say, no thanks, I think I'll patronize another union or just handle things myself. I'm in favor of choice, competition, and accountability in every aspect of life. So when unions employ political coercion, where they use the state to get special benefits that freeze out competition or compel workers to pay dues, whether they want to or not, that's when they no longer become a beneficial organization for the workers, but become a threat every bit as much as big taxing government.
How is it that capital investment and competition benefit the workers?
Well, without capital investment, no worker would be making very much at all. I mean, think of it. A capital investment can be thought of in two ways. It's number one, the funds necessary, typically from people's savings, to buy the tools of production to start a business. And capital investment also is can be considered those tools. You know, the machinery that enables you to dig the foundation for a home with a backhoe instead of a spoon. If you're employed to dig a foundation for a home, but the extent of the capital you have at your disposal is a spoon, you're going to have to work awfully hard and long before you ever get to completing the first foundation. Whereas with a backhoe, you can do it in a day or two. Your worth as a worker is far greater when you have tools like backhoes to get the job done than your worth when all you can produce is what you can do with a spoon.
That I think is one of the most interesting things about the free market, how it's constantly harmonizing self-interest, saying how I
Yeah.
can't get any money out of your pocket unless you voluntarily give it to me. I'm not entitled to any of your time unless you choose to spend it with me, and you have the right to withdraw it in the future. So even these things that appear to be self-interested, or even if they are self-interested, you still are benefiting people. Bezos with books is probably the best thing. It's so funny. Heard, I think it was Pat Buchanan talking about, the price of books were a higher number of dollars. So
Mm.
even forget about inflation. When
Yeah.
he was younger, or when his first books came out, than they are today on Amazon. They've actually decreased in price in spite of the quantitative easing that the federal government's given us. So the capital investment benefiting workers is just the perfect example of harmonizing interests. Again,
Exactly. And
a-
Adam
as
Smith.
as if politicians don't benefit. Yet Nancy Pelosi's actually a nun who works for
Yeah,
a
yeah.
monastery. She's never profited. Chuck Schumer, he's homeless. He's just trying to help us. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, no, no. That's right. I've often wondered at what point does a politician's motivations cease to be self-focused or self-interested and suddenly become other feeling and compassionate and only focused on others. Does that happen on election day, or does it happen on the day or the day they take office, or when does that actually happen? But Adam Smith expressed it so well 250 years ago when he said, if I can remember it verbatim, he said, "It is not from the benevolence or goodwill, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we get our daily sustenance, but rather through their own regard for their own self-interest." I mean, isn't that true? I mean, you want to get somebody to give you something or do something for you. There are a couple ways to do it. One, you can take a club and beat the crap out of them, but whatever you get is going to likely be a one-time occurrence. Or you can say, "Hey, I got something for you, and let me say why it would be worth it to you to give me what you've got if I give you what I've got." I mean, it's one way or the other, folks. Either you can beat the crap out of people to get what you want, or you can harmonize your desires with theirs and find peaceful, cooperative ways to deal with them.
Final topic on understanding of history. Actually, two more. When it comes to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, the big ones that come to mind being Medicare and Medicaid. This sort of was a transformation from either leaving people to their own devices or having unstable things, as opposed to ushering in a social safety net, which we
Yeah.
benefit from to this day. What, if anything, is wrong with the general understanding people have of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs?
The Great Society, of course, encompassed a number of things, not only expansion in welfare payments and entitlements, but also increases or new ventures, I should say, into medical care for the indigent and for those of elderly age. One of the flaws in the whole thing was the failure to look at the long term. A lot of these kinds of programs, when government first starts them up, Social Security at first, of course, lots of people we took money from a lot of people and gave it to a very few people. Actuarially, that looked pretty good for a time. But all of these programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they're on the road to bankruptcy. And each time it looked like that was in the offing, politicians would patch it up a little bit by raising taxes, maybe in a few cases cutting benefits, or at least adding years to the time when you could first begin to collect in the case of Social Security. But right now, the actuaries at those various institutions know full well, and there have been plenty of articles written about this, that in the next decade or so, Medicare, Social Security are going to face calamitous financial problems. And that's when we may look back and decide, maybe it wasn't such a good idea in the first place. People who want to have a secure and free and prosperous future, not only for them, but for their grandkids, need to be thinking long term, not just short term. Otherwise, they'll go in for any sucker scheme that seems to throw something at you. But I often like to say this. I lecture a lot about Roman history. And I like to point out, if I could go back to ancient Rome, let's say very late in the Republic, as liberties were crumbling, and before long, they were all lost and the empire was created. If I could go back and speak to the mob, say 50 BC, I would like to say to them, "Hey, folks, you've been on this welfare state bandwagon for 100 years. And a lot of you are feeling pretty good. It seems like you're getting more than you're paying in. So what's wrong with it? But let me tell you, I come from the future and I know where this is headed. It's going to bankrupt society. And you will so weaken yourselves. You will become so dependent upon politicians. Future generations will care not a whit about whether they earn their income by theft from others through the political process or through their own efforts. Your society will so decay that in my day, we'll be reading about you in the history books as a civilization that committed suicide and felt they were having a lot of fun along the way. Is that what you want? And I'd like to think maybe some of the Romans would have said, maybe we should think long term. Maybe we don't want to go down unsustainable paths. That's that's one of the central problems of welfare states. The fact that they make a lot of people feel good for a time, but they set into motion forces which destroy society in the long run if they're not turned back. But I would also like to tell people, hey, fundamentally, something that's rooted in wrong is not likely to end well. And when you advocate things like government forcible redistribution, robbing Peter to pay Paul, you're talking about theft. And even if you're on the receiving end and it makes you feel good, and if it makes you feel good that other people who seem to deserve it are getting something, you're still justifying theft. Aren't there other means? Is that as creative as you can get? I mean, a free society, we just throw our liberties to the politicians and in favor of the crumbs that they send our way and think that's the end of it. A free and creative people will come up with plenty of ways to solve problems. Sending your money to Washington, laundering it through a federal bureaucracy that then spits out a portion of it is the dumbest way to solve problems that I can think of.
I was thinking of the high administrative cost that you get with something like this because there's nothing anti-free market about pooling your resources together. In fact, today, because of free market innovations, it's easier than ever. We could
Yeah,
have the Ocasio-Cortez healthcare fund where everyone chips in and your name's on the list. So then when you need healthcare later in life, well, then you get money out of this thing.
yeah,
That could be your single payer sort of system, but they're not interested in that. I love the idea of taking care of people when they're older. My only beef is not letting people opt out and the state
yeah,
monopolizing the money supply. But you get what I'm saying.
yeah,
That
yeah,
why has this been such a hard sell? Considering it's not that we hate taking care of people, we hate this group's claim that they have the right to forcibly take care of
yeah.
people. Why has that been such a hard sell?
Well, in so much of life, the near term, here and now, forget the future, short term focused stuff is an easier sell. I wish it wasn't, but it's just the way things are. But we are given brains. Human beings, each of us has a brain and the capacity to think. And we should be thinking about these things far more deeply than what you can put on a bumper sticker. But people like AOC, they can barely understand it if it'll fit on a bumper sticker. They just don't seem to care or even think through the long run consequences or the alternatives that might be viable. Um, I think that's the shame of it all. But you just have to constantly ask people, hey, step up to the plate, be an adult. As babies, we're all socialists. Think of it. When you were 3 years old, you were a socialist. Why? Because you didn't care what anything cost. You want it now. You don't care where it came from or who paid for it, and you scream bloody murder if you didn't get it. But part of the process of growing up is realizing, wow, there are other people on this planet besides me, and they have rights just as I do. And maybe I need to find another way to get what I want instead of just holding them up. And because if I get to do that, what if they claim the right to do it to me? Those are things we have to ponder when we become adults. But people like AOC remain babies. And when they get older, they simply and get into the political process. They simply become babies with guns.
And you know what? I don't want to use, the term like, well, that they live in a fantasy land. But if you say something like X should be free, whatever you think X is,
Mhm.
it's literally like saying the military is free because the government pays for it. Or
Yeah, exactly.
we could make houses free. We just give the Catholic Church a monopoly on taxation, and then the Catholic Church will buy everyone a house. This way it's free. Like you
Yeah,
would clearly see through that scam immediately. Even if
yeah,
money's not involved, every piece of concrete allocated toward this group is not allocated toward other groups. So it's literally like they're lying when they say something is free. Have you found any really good seeds to plant in people when they think that there's two ways there's the free way and then there's the people like Lawrence Reed who make me want to pay for things and that's why I hate him.
Well, I get maybe a number of things you could say to hopefully prod them to be more thoughtful people. I would say, well, if all this stuff was free, how do we get a $31 trillion national debt? Uh, and what is it about laundering your money through the political process that reduces the cost of something? Explain that to me, please. I'm not going to just assume that you're right about that. Please tell me, how does that work? Um, I would defy anybody to tell me how laundering your money through the political process makes things cheaper. Um, and other things like, well, in the long run, is it better for a person to be as independent as his abilities allow him to be? Or would it be better if he were dependent upon people in political power for his livelihood? I mean, that's a pretty big decision, isn't it? I mean, that has massive implications at the personal level as well as for society at large. And yet we sort of blithely assume, oh, what's the difference? And in fact, if we get it quicker and easier through the political process, well, why not do it that way? Short-term thinkers who don't look at all consequences or the long run end up like snake oil salesmen. They're pushing all this stuff, say, look what I'm going to get for you. It's free. It's just repeating age-old fallacies that have never ended well.
And again, just like the earlier example with not looking at the cost of things, they also don't do it when it comes to subsidies. So the biggest
Yeah.
things that are subsidized, healthcare, housing, and higher education, have all constantly gone up in price. To forget college textbooks, just
Mhm.
something ridiculous. They doesn't seem to care. Well, we can leave it here because we've gone over. I'm so appreciative of your time. How does subsidizing something make it more expensive?
Well, first of all, you got the cost of the subsidy. And secondly, the subsidy tends to have an effect on the providers of that service, which is they're less conscious of their costs. After all, they're being underwritten or their customers are being guaranteed in some way. Their mistakes are being papered over. So why be careful about such things? It makes things naturally inefficient when you're not having to focus on that bottom line because you're not in danger of going broke if you don't. So just think in your personal life. When is it proper for an adult to say to their children, "That's enough. No, I'm not going to continually give you this." I mean, don't we do that all the time? Often parents give in and they do things that you could say is a kind of subsidy for their children. But I think most of us understand that there comes a point where that's not healthy. There comes a point where you're going to set that child back if you continue to do that. That the best thing for that child is to say, stand on your own, or don't expect forever handouts. So we sort of know that when it comes to our personal lives, or at least most of us do. Why we think it should be any different when the government plays the role of national nanny is beyond me.
Do you have time for one more question?
Oh, yeah.
Uh, Thank you. This
Mhm.
is one of the big ones that we get, that when you have this free market, you are free to do bad things such as discriminate. And therefore, we didn't see real achievements from Black Americans until the Civil Rights Act. What, if anything, is wrong about that narrative?
Oh, a number of things. One is we did see improvement, especially after Jim Crow laws, which are, again, laws of government, state and local, but still laws of government, not private actors in a competitive and free marketplace. We did see improvement for decades in the lot of previously oppressed peoples. As we freed the market, freed people, they improved their standards of living. In fact, time and again, no matter what you're measuring, whether it be uh, the rate of intact families versus broken families, or of economic income, you'll find those numbers steadily fell until about 1965, when we started the Great Society with massive subsidies. And then progress stopped. When we started subsidizing both good and bad behavior, suddenly the one measurement of improvement in standards of living of various groups stagnated. They, And that's what things like subsidies and political intervention do. There's nothing about being in politics that suddenly makes you wiser than when you were in the private sector. There's nothing about politics that says you're going to be more compassionate than people in the private sector. But there is a lot about politics that says you're, you will do the things that tend to satisfy your self-interest, and your accountability is quite limited as a politician. As long as you can sell people the snake oil, they'll keep drinking it unless there's a huge awakening. In a free market, you produce bad products, so you're going to be out of business a lot quicker than politicians go out of business, even when they produce disaster time and time again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Reed, for your time. Thanks to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute and Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone. I want to end with one of my favorite quotes from Thomas Sowell, author of Civil Rights Rhetoric or Reality. But the number of blacks in professional, technical, and other high-level occupations more than doubled in the decade preceding the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In other occupations, gains by blacks were greater during the 1940s, where there was practically no civil rights legislation. Then, during the 1950s, in various skilled trades, the income of blacks relative to whites more than doubled. More evidence that the free market gives us what we need, and the state is constantly the parasite on society. Mr. Reed, thank you so much for your time, sir.
A pleasure once again. Thank you, Keith.